Good afternoon. Failed at the first hurdle. Welcome to our afternoon panel on a post-truth and soft power. We've just seen Psychometrics by Alan Warburton. He's also recently just released a brand new film in the last week called Goodbye Uncanny Valley, which I highly recommend because he's analysing what it means that CGI can now completely and accurately render reality for our notions of truth and vision and how we can perceive of what is objectively real. Unfortunately, Hubbard could not be here to moderate, so I'll be moderating this afternoon's panel. Warren Ellis mentioned yesterday in his keynote that we hear the word fake news too much, that it's almost become sort of ubiquitous and thus meaningless in some way, or at least not critiqued enough. But one of the things I find interesting about this new discussion around post-truth is the idea that we're actually now starting to question the things we're told more. We're starting, or some people anyway, starting to become more critical of what we're told and the way we're told them. I don't think that the idea of post-truth is a new idea. I think that we're now in a position where we are questioning the objective reality that we're often told through rational science, through media, and through technology. So this is a good thing in a way that it's disrupting the accepted notions we've had of the binary between truth and not truth. We've got a big panel today. We've got 4 separate presentations, and I'm going to introduce them one by one. And then afterwards we'll have a Q&A, and of course we'll have time for questions from the audience, so please keep your brain on overdrive so we can have some interesting questions. And if they're not interesting, we'll just ignore them and move on. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Georgina Voss. She is an artist and writer and a senior lecturer at the London College of Communication, as well as a co-founder and director of research consultancy Strange Telemetry. Let's give a hand for George.
Thank you. I fucking hate magicians. Really, really exceptionally so. They make me very, very angry and very, very upset. If I'm ever at any kind of wedding or party or gathering where someone sidles up, possibly with a deck of cards or a glass of strangely shaped water, my first thought is to run or just get angry. I get angry. But I've been trying to figure out why exactly magicians, and particularly street magic, makes me as furious as it does. It's been a way of trying to move past the emotion and the affect of that to try and figure out structurally what have we got going on here? What is the thing that's actually happening to make me furious? So, we had a referendum recently, and you may have heard about this. And it's very, very hard for someone from Britain, someone in my position, to consider this referendum without making at least kind of like howling noises, kind of less kind of critical, performative lecture, kind of, working through this cleanly, and more kind of like, kind of sounds. But I've been trying to figure out what's going on. And one of the things I've been noticing is in the language and the way that this is presented in the news, we have a lot of talk about magic and about magical solutions and magical thinking that's going on here. And the way that these things are often presented as something that we're getting a top-level story, but underneath it, there's some form of illusion is being permitted through this. And again, I get emotional about this, but at the same time, I've been trying to at least kind of critically figure out what is going on here. Why are the ways that this is being presented to us so infuriating? So the structure of magic, at least kind of performative magic, has a number of different roles. And one of those first roles can be the use of the term of magic, of illusion, to conceal something technically complex. In the film The Prestige, this is Christian Bale being a magician, still angry. Bale plays the role of Alfred Borden, who is a magician and a very technically accomplished magician. And the way that he uses magic, his language of magic, is to kind of to conceal the technological truth, the underpinning of what is actually going on, but say it's magic. That's what you've got. Where has that ball gone? It's magic. What's going on inside your iPhone? It's magic. Is it servos? No, it's magic. Microphone array? Magic. And I kind of feel that this kind of language of kind of, concealing things through the sheer technological complexity of what's going on is also this form of magical thinking that permeates a lot of the political landscape at the moment. So, can technology solve the Brexit border puddle? Could airships patrol the Irish border? No, magical thinking. So we have here this kind of, what's going on? Like, how are we going to solve this massively complex international political, regulatory rigmarole we appear to have found ourselves in for the past 12 months? Magic, technology, magic. It's like, it ain't going to happen. Magic. And there are ways of kind of like pulling back to strip against this and kind of bring these technological complexities to the forefront and also find the affect and the difficulties in them. This is a piece of work that I did last year with Wesley Goatley, where we were interested in how to manifest and make present the very complex and immaterial facets of airspace, something which highly affects our forms of travel, many of us who are here today, but is also and is bound up in huge international, complexities and lock-togethers and kind of these little things that grind against each other. But it's very, very hard to make sense of. So we tracked in and we gathered the signals that were being sent down from planes, and we mapped them in real time across a rotating set of maps of different forms of airspace infrastructure to give a sense of both the presence of the airspace over Belgium and the kind of the multiplicities of it, the different forms and layerings of what airspace itself actually is. And this, this is a piece of work I'm very proud of, and it also got us into a series of quite difficult conversations with the Belgian air traffic authorities, who were happy at the end and who came to the opening night, but it wasn't clear until that point that they would. But we still have this way of thinking, it can't be that difficult. We're going to deal with this. This was from a newspaper last week. I picked it up, I think, when I was at Gatwick. I nearly laid this page open because it was a free newspaper on every seat around this bit of the kind of landing area, the kind of the waiting area, because we're not kind of thinking necessarily about how the complexities actually are going to run into play. But there's something else at play here. It's not just technological complexities too. It's language and its performance. And again, certainly in the UK, one of the major things that's come out of the past 18 months or so, the past 2 years, has not just been kind of a leading of technological complexity, but also a language around this as well, of like magic money machines, a performativity of description, of the language itself, the emotion it tries to churn up of how this is going to happen. And this is the second part of magic. This is the performance. Again, in The Prestige, Christian Bale, Alfred Borden's counterpart, played by Hugh Jackman, is Robert Angier. And he's not technically great. He's all right, like a bit shaky hands, a bit. But what he is he is confident, and he is charming, and he performs, and he summons into him, with great confidence and great calmness, the attention of an audience. And he makes them want to believe. And this is the part that I'm interested in. Because the technological underframings of a lot of the systems we deal with are certainly there and present and material, but there's this wrapper of performativity, of persuasion that comes in it. So soft power was a term described by Joseph Nye to describe the different forms of power, particularly that the US engaged with China during the Cold War period and other parts of the world. And it was his way of trying to think about how do you persuade without force? How do you persuade without coercion? How do you persuade with charm, with making people want to come on board, with cultural power? Be like, yeah, it's going to be all right, it's going to be fine. Just like, come, just believe. For this particular form of power, storytelling matters. It's not just about, as Nye says, whose army wins, but also whose story wins. And this has become an enormously popular way of framing the types of engagement that particularly happen at the state level, which is what I'm very interested in the past couple of decades. But in that past few decades, other kind of like noises have arisen where people have said, well, this is okay, but what you seem to be pushing a bit too hard for here is like numbers. So we know that Facebook and other elements have a soft power effect in terms of persuasion, but maybe it's not about counting how many followers there are or counting how many bots. We want to know how it happens. How does soft power, how does persuasion manifest under the bonnet? What does that look like? Not just in scale, but actually in quality and texture itself. So this is a photo taken from several years ago, which you can date by the fact that I've got a camera and not an iPhone. And you can also, I think the iPhone was out at this stage, but I was a PhD student at the time, so I couldn't afford one. I did my PhD looking at pornography and the pornography industry. And this photo was taken in Phoenix, Arizona, in the hotel room where I was staying, before I was heading out to do ethnographic fieldwork at a trade show. The photo was taken because at this point I was in the full embodied, emotional, affective manifest of a full balls panic attack at this point, like full adrenaline levels up to here, genuinely terrified about going out into the trade show and having to be, again, that person who was empathetic, who would invite difficult conversations about stigma and deviance and business models and technology to an audience that I didn't really know in a country that I wasn't from, and being very aware of how I was going to be read for it. So I took this photo as a kind of a way of grounding myself into this, of being like this, it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. Howling dog noises. So when you study pornography, people are like, oh, it sounds great. You must see all sorts of things. You go to trade shows. I bet they give you all sorts of stuff. And I was like, yes, they do. This is a pen from kink.com. It is not a good pen. I think it's in black ink. The top of it is a bit scratchy. Even when I first got it and tried to write with it, just like, fucking come on. Didn't write well. But this was one of the things I ended up picking up across the trade shows. Soft power is very hard to quantify. And certainly for the pornography industry at that time, there was very little material that I could work with in a quantitative sense, in a manner that many of my colleagues were doing so, to try and kind of like get the systems in place, count it, get a graph, very good. And I was like, well, I can't do that. And I'm also trying to figure out like the emotional, kind of the stigmatized and the deviance part of this. So I have to talk to people and figure out stuff. And I would go to these trade shows as a way of kind of meeting people and kind of setting up conversations and trying to instantiate trust and being very mindful this is a very deviant space, and also wanting to do right by my research participants. And a lot of the time would like run through, try and be calm as during these shows, but would run back with this big kind of bag full of swag at the end of it. These little objects I would take back to my hotel room at the time to just be like, this is fine, this is going to be fine. I got a lot of these, and I got a lot of the trade publications as well, the adult video news, the things that we used to kind of discuss what was going on in the industry, the things that initially had started as reviews, but then became gossip and in-jokes and kind of, the actual under-the-skin discussions of what the industry looks like. And I became interested in kind of like, what do these kind of these objects, these artifacts tell us about kind of how the power manifests here? What expectations does the industry have for itself? This is, I think, the classic sociology of expectations quote, which is also missing about 4 of the authors because it would go off that way. But it talks about how expectations are the wishful enactments of a desired future, and that we perform them, we make them real, we try and summon the world in some way. Many years after I finished my PhD, I did the doctoral research and had moved path in quite an extensive way. I pulled together this work for a piece that was in London Design Week, Wild Spirits, as a way of trying to pull out, again, that affect and that emotion of what the narratives were around technology and innovation and deviance, but the expectations around in the space, using only material that I'd gathered from the shows, from the trade publications itself. And part of these are ways of trying to think about, where the future had been seen from different points of view. That in 1992, for the adult entertainment industry, CD-ROM was the future, and that was it. That was what they were staking their money on. But it was also a way to try and kind of pull out the uncertainties, the fragilities that were there in this industry, the kind of like not necessarily knowing what was going to be happening. These kind of payment systems are massively important to pornography for fairly obvious reasons. But there's been a lot of kind of like shakiness about what payment system you could have. So there was this constant rifling through and panic of like, PayPal, is it the industry's best new friend? eBay buys PayPal, will restrictions follow? New passport commerce accounts, a new PayPal alternative, And these were the kind of this anxiety attack that would be rippling through the industry. And sometimes it wasn't even that specific. Sometimes it was just like the future, the unexpected is going to be happening. We're always looking for the next big thing. New technologies can take it almost anywhere. There's kind of this constant frenzy of just like, fuck, what are we going to do? There's kind of the emotion that was swirling through it. And it's this aspect of influence and emotion that I'm really interested in for this particular point. It might be bad form to quote your own work, but it's fine. This is a piece that I wrote with Carolyn Bassett and Ed Steinmuller a couple of years ago, where we were looking at the co-constitution of science fiction and technological systems. And one of the things we were thinking about here was emotion and effective force. It's not about precise information, it's this form of influence that these kind of cultural bodies have on each other. It's also about the influence and the affect that they have. And from the swag that I gathered, I could see that. And I've kind of quite deliberately cut the names off this because partly there's interesting things about who works these firms, what they're like under the skin, but also the names aren't the thing here. So this is a blanket that I got given as swag from a trade show, and it's comfy. It's grey and it's soft, and it was produced by one of the major webmaster companies. And I've still kept it in its packet. I really like it. I think it's kind of just a nice, it's a blanket. You want a blanket, like it's something that gives you a sense of normalcy about the industry. But the soft power that kind of operates here as well is also about kind of understanding the kind of the shared cultural norms. And, you can't talk about pornography with a straight face. I mean, you can try and do the kind of, it's a very serious industry and very technologically active and but then you go to the trade show and you get given what is a tape measure with a little, the thing that says size matters. And you're just like, this is great. Well done. It's got a little spirit level as well, because it's actually, quite useful. But it's this kind of element of this kind of letting off of steam under the surface, oh my God, we know what this industry is. We know this is ridiculous. We come on, we just have this tiny tape measure. And the company that made this is not, none of these companies are production studios. These are the companies that do the kind of the billing, they do the accountancy, they do the IT infrastructure. It's still for this industry, but this understanding of this is what the space looks like if you can actually get to kind of the heart, the emotions in it. This is one of my favourite kind of pieces, which I'm still working with for some other projects. This is a T-shirt that I got given at one of the earlier trade shows. What you can't see here, which I've deliberately folded over, is that the woman presented here is basically topless from this point down. And on the back of the T-shirt, this same picture is there and much larger. This was a swag, the packs of T-shirts that were brought in by a company who were very new in the industry, and was this is the swag we want to give to you. This is what we're going to be, presenting to you. And the guys in the industry were just like, what is this? I can't take this home and wear this when I'm lawn mowing. I can't wear this around the house in front of my children. So there was this massive friction between understanding that, how an industry is portrayed from the outside, what is sent forward, and what comes back. And then finally, this is again to get the name cut off. This is another pen. This is from another billing company as well. I think this one's blue. It's exploded over my bag at various times. It's not a great pen. But it's this kind of, again, this binding together of the kind of the technological systems of the swag here, the kind of soft power that operates, with this kind of this very normal thing, this really, really shit pen that's just this is a normal thing. This is how this goes. So one of the things that kind of happens at the end of the Prestige, or kind of throughout it, is this understanding that performativity is part of it, the technical capacity is part of it, but these two things knot together very well. And this is how the kind of the process works. This is how the power comes through, not just through the performance, but understanding how they hold each other together. And I guess I want to wrap this up by thinking about a quote from Jack Stilgo actually a few days ago. He was talking about autonomous cars and talking about the kind of the reshaping of the world, which is being put forward by many large technology companies, and I would argue by many state bodies as well, of just the world is changing, we're going to refigure it, we're going to rematerialize it. And he says, well, ignorance of infrastructure has been a deliberate project of those selling the myth of autonomy who won't admit their emerging responsibilities. Both the denial that there are technical difficulties here, but the performance as well, the slickness that this is going to be easy, this is going to be fine, there's nothing to worry about, just keep your eyes away from things. There is a case for this. Everything's going to be fine. Everything's okay. And I guess what I'd want to finish with is by saying, if you have these systems that are they're confident and charming and holding the audience together, just stay a minute and kind of think what exactly is going on behind the teeth. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Georgina Voss, for an incredible presentation. Our next guest is Navine G. Khan-Dossos. Navine is showing work down at the Photodoc. She has her piece Expanding and Remaining in there. This summer, she got married to James Bridle, whose work is on the other side of the wall from hers. So I've been commenting on how beautiful it is that she's got one piece of work on one side of the wall, and then backing onto it is his work. She also did our wedding invitations. Join me in welcoming artist Navine G. Khan-Dossos.
It's so romantic. Romance. Hi. This is going to be a very different talk to George's talk. First of all, I'd like to thank Impakt and Natalie and Tobias. It's really great to be showing here, and also to be amongst so many people who I consider my kin, even though I'm a painter. I've changed the name of the talk. I changed it around because I didn't really want to talk about what you wanted me to talk about. But also I actually thought that by just making this little change, it opened up something about the work that's in the show and how I'm going to discuss it. First of all, no, fuck it, I'm not going to tell you about me, it's not that interesting. I am going to talk about ISIS graphic design. This talk is all in Garamond. Garamond is ISIS's favourite font. It's also mine. So, post-power. The interesting thing about talking about this piece of work now, which I made a year ago, which I am going to show you, it's the next slide, I promise, is that I made this very much at the height of what we consider to be ISIS's power. And right now, Raqqa, which is probably the place where this work, the origin of this work is from, is kind of now very much under the control of local forces that are being helped by American pilots overhead. There's like 2 levels going in there. And it's very much the time of the unraveling of a geographical location of this group. But I think it's also really important to consider the digital caliphate as a space that is potentially still something to be contested. And I think that power and the implications of that are something that are going to go on for quite a while. So this ISIS thing is really not over yet, and so I think we have to think about this object, which I'm about to show you, as it's not quite a relic, but it's kind of moving towards being an artifact. In terms of soft truth, why have I sort of said that? I think the reason I'm talking about this is because a lot of the work that I make as a painter does follow certain forms of research that are close to an investigative journalism. But the work is really not a form of evidence. Nothing is being uncovered per se, but there's a process of transformation going on through this act of painting. You know, you can't take the paintings I'm going to show you into court and use as evidence. It's actually just a way of understanding and untangling what's happening on the other side of the world in a completely different framework of understanding the world. For me, painting also allows me a certain form of mimicry, of labour in particular, which really lies at the kind of sub-level of propaganda, and we don't always think about that. There's also something very tangible for me about this process, trying to touch something at a great distance from me, which I'll talk about in a bit, both geographically, politically, ethically, and technologically. And I'm constantly trying to think about my relationship to this kind of continuous drip feed of terror that has been present in my life since 9/11, but probably much longer than that. So this is Expanding Remaining. This is actually 36 panels. You'll only see 30 because 6 of them got stuck in the States. This is a graphic design layout of issue 5 of Dabiq magazine. Dabiq magazine was the official propaganda magazine of ISIS between July 2014 and July 2016. Dabiq is named after a town in northern Syria, which is mentioned in one of the hadiths as being the site of Armageddon. Sorry, I should probably say I'm talking about the kind of, not the magic half, but the kind of wicked problems half. You should probably work that out by now. So ISIS believe very much that this place, Dabiq, is where they were going, the Muslim fighters and the believers were going to encounter the infidel forces, and they were going to bring about end times. I think it's really also very important to remember when we talk about ISIS that we are talking about the official magazine of a death cult. There were 15 issues of this magazine that were all released as a PDF. And I think for me, that's really the key to why I made this work, that this was a magazine designed in this way that had layouts that suggested a kind of horizontal reading, but as a PDF, you were only ever reading it vertically. There was a real tension between the physical object, the possibility of a physical object, and it being simply a kind of digital file. And that's also the key to how ISIS is able to sort of disperse its propaganda in a way that if this was a physical magazine being sent in the post, they would just never have had the kind of coverage they did have. And I noticed that these kind of designs of spreads suggested a physical object, but it never has been a physical object. Unless perhaps you think about some of the ISIS fanboys, I'm sure there's somebody out there who's printed it out and carefully made, like, each edition. Also, this magazine is produced for a Western audience, and I think that's very important to me, that this was produced in English, and there was something about it, something about the font, using garum on these things, that felt like it was being made for me, in a way. It was reaching towards me. So who is Dabiq reaching? Certainly it is some of the hardline kind of online followers who are part of this kind of digital caliphate. But also normal people. We are naturally, I think a lot of us, if we admit it, intrigued by the rise of ISIS and their ability to penetrate the collective consciousness. And I consider myself amongst those. I have limits and boundaries to that engagement with the material, but I'm also willing to admit that. But I think really the key reader of this magazine is the Western media and the press. And I believe really that they are the target audience of this publication, because it's here that ISIS kind of presented their military might, but also what life was like under their daily rule, and what the future held. It's also no coincidence that each issue was published just after a major IS-related action in Europe, and that there would be a renewed interest from the media, and they would all of a sudden like knock out this kind of new issue that had all of the details. And if you read reports from major media outlets, they're taking most of their information from this magazine. But for me, I was really wondering when I was reading the first few issues, like, what is going on in the editorial office, right? Who is the graphic designer? What is their training? Like, what are they? Do they have mood boards and layouts? Like, this is ultimately the same process as any other magazine production, And I was wondering, were they literally laying out the work, like you see it in the show on these kind of boards at the end of the room, looking to see how the articles were reading together, what the spreads were looking like? I wondered if they had discarded coffee cups around and sort of waste baskets full of drafts of paper and like balls of things that had gone wrong. I was really kind of looking, and actually Alan's video at the beginning was really reminded me of this physical space and the action of labour that I was trying to get to as a way of understanding. Removing all the content from a single PDF is at the sort of beginning of this kind of series of paintings. And I replicate every single page in the issue. I'm basically looking at the text layout in columns, but I'm also looking for the small failures that come when you make something very, very quickly, really at pace. The paintings are also painted very quickly. There's only one layer of paint. And I was really trying to emulate what it would be to be making a magazine within 24 hours. Like, the speed at which that was doing, you were kind of preparing that document. And that through painting it, I was starting to notice where images didn't quite line up, but also picking out orphans and widows at the ends of sentences. The etymological root of magazine is also a very interesting thing to think about, as it has its roots in a military lexicon. It's a storehouse, a place where gunpowder or munitions might be kept. And I think this is an apt description of a file whose content is considered by many governments to be dangerous. The magazine follows a similar layout to any standard publication sharing this name. Here we have the cover of issue 5, which features the Kaaba in Mecca. And then you have the editor's foreword, which reflects the same imagery as the cover. I want to make one thing really clear, though, is that I never reproduce content created by ISIS, and I don't see any need to represent this material. I do my best to remove as quickly as possible as much as I can so I'm not exposed to it, but also I don't want to expose you to it. It's not necessary, and to be honest, if you're that interested, you can go and find it online. But by looking at the structural composition, I'm trying to sidestep the very material at the heart of the propaganda in order to expose other aspects that might offer another way to look at the subject. I was first drawn to the magazine by this particular layout, and the one that follows in the next slide. Something is not right here. This is not a diagram, it's not a news report, and it's not a news feature. It's a very strange composition. And being across 2 pages, but read horizontally, you were never seeing the full picture. And I just wondered, what are the conditions under which this is being made? Again, like what kind of computer? And actually, I'm not very good at computers, but you can read in the PDF that it's been made by InDesign on a Mac. And actually, ISIS don't like Macs, so it means that they've got one somewhere in their territory just for the graphic designer. This is also a layout that really interested me. It's sort of got an urgency and a dynamism about it. I mean, I'm also a painter, so I kind of look at these things in kind of compositional forms. But this made me feel a bit nauseous and almost seasick. And I noticed when I took the images out that it wasn't from the images themselves, it was the composition of the page that was causing me to feel a bit pukey. And this is not an act of censorship. What I'm doing is not trying to redact things. I'm trying to get closer to something that happens before the content is dropped in, and a design process that happens before, not after the fact. These are spreads of the battlefield. The 2 ones that we've just seen are spreads of photographs of a battlefield. They're action shots that are taken across a vast territory by teams who send images back to a centralized office. This huge collection of reportage was something that was actually quite amazing and not really seen before. But it was also important to have a place, like a central location where that was collated. And you'll see later that it wasn't just a magazine, there were also many other aspects to this kind of mediatic kind of propaganda machine that were coming out of this kind of media center. But ISIS also wanted to focus on other horizons. It wasn't just the battlefield. Here we have on the left a diagram taken from plans for preparing a new currency for the caliphate. And there was actually a very fascinating online video about them wanting to mint their own gold and silver coinage. It's very much showing that ISIS is a part of a wider infrastructure, which is not just military, but judicial, medical, educational. And we see reports on plans for future road building, alongside feel-good stories of ice cream factories reopening. But on the right is also an example of ISIS being aware of a wider media coverage about them. They're very much concerned about how they are seen by others and often appropriate material where they can. This is a Wall Street Journal infographic showing parties that display friction or outright aggression towards one another are finding themselves aligned in a desire to counter Islamic State. And the groups are then kind of and the coloured lines between these parties represent shared interests. And they basically just take this stuff and use it and represent it when it's relevant to them. Dabiq magazine is, as I said before, part of a much wider network of propaganda. And here we have adverts within the magazine for their online videos on the left, and on the right, their radio channel. And this really interested me, the one on the right, because in the removal of the images, this work with all these kind of diagonals starts to really look like an early 20th century painting from Russia, or like, these kind of constructivist images that were dealing with this kind of technological field of communication. There's something for me that was both familiar and totally alien at the same time, and it was that made these pages very uncanny. But Dabiq didn't make it past 2 years. And there are various theories about what happened and why the next magazine, Rumiyah, takes over in September 2016. Some people believe that the editor was killed in a drone strike around issue 9 or 10, and whoever was continuing the in-house style was struggling to maintain a sense of stylistic continuity. But most analysts refer to the fact that the town of Dabiq, the supposed site of the beginning of the endgames between the infidels and believers, had been taken from ISIS by a Turkish-led military offensive, and so it was no longer part of the caliphate, and they had to rebrand. These then are pages from Rumiyah magazine referring to Rome. And you see the moving of goalposts where ISIS are taking the battle to Europe instead of in their own kind of geographical terrain. But more interestingly for me, perhaps, is this, it's not just the loss of territory, but it's this turning towards the West as being the site. And you also see other things about how much content is coming in from the territory and being displayed, and how they're replacing just not having as much to tell you about. We also have a really important shift in layout. It's not just describing the military operations and the civilian life that it was before, but it's also heavily referencing and using or relying on infographics, cartography, and most interestingly for me, having studied Islamic art, these kind of Islamic decorations. Most of these Islamic kind of patterns have been taken from vast online royalty-free graphics dumps. I did quite a lot of research into sort of trying to find these original images, and they were often produced in India, and you could kind of get this pink one, in pink or turquoise or blue or green or whatever you wanted. And we see these kind of ornate cartouches headlining articles to remind the reader to be patient and await the coming victories. So it's really kind of changing these kind of goalposts. And the titles of the work are the titles of the articles. I was also fascinated by the array of styles and this mishmash of Ottoman, Moroccan, Syrian, and Indian-inspired arabesques. What these remind us of and what they pertain to are religious texts. This kind of intricate, non-figurative language of Islamic art is a way to frame the sacred word of the Quran, and that's really where kind of Islamic art is from in origin, is always to support the word. But these are quite camp in a way, with their pink and red. They sort of convey a religious authority through ornamentation, but it's very different to what Dabiq wanted to do. Where the action shots and documentary photos can no longer be provided by this massive network of photographers sending their data back into the media centre, we don't have a sense of local colour anymore, but instead we have this sense of an abstract world of ornament that lends a helping hand to a credibility and a sense of command over the content. We also see in Rumia a recycling of stock layouts, with minor adjustments from each month depending on what the article is about. These two examples essentially are heaven and hell, and they're basically pages of quotations from various hadith, scaring the reader or exalting them, depending on which issue they happen to be scrolling through. But you can see that basically they've used exactly the same formula, and they've just sort of changed the content a little bit to kind of reformulate what they want the page to be about. You can also feel that the high point of ISIS graphic design is somehow past, and that the turbulent compositions and the diagonals that we saw before have been left behind. And then all that remains is this regurgitation of mass-produced infographics that can be easily downloaded from these bucket dumps and modified to fit one's program of propaganda. These two examples are articles and single-page compositions that, again, rely heavily on graphics instead of content. And that's why in these kind of second round of pictures, you just see a lot more detail, because I'm only showing the graphics. I'm not showing photographs or text. And you can really see in that process just how little content is actually on each page, how little they're delivering. It's all about the kind of structure and very little about the actual words. Both of these articles are called Operations, and they look at the battles that are happening on their own soil, but mostly it's about the battles that they envisage happening on kind of exterior territory. And with ISIS losing ground, they were simultaneously using maps that pertain to new areas expansion, as well as little tiny kind of like this river here, local taking of territory. On the left, we see the ominous shadows of fighters looming out from a world map that shows interconnections. But they could be flights, or they could be an internet speed. Just actually, there's no reason to be using that image. It doesn't really pertain to anything that's written in the article. It's just a graphic about interconnectivity. And this global map in particular on the left is used over and over again as a kind of graphic layout to try and talk about expansion. But really, you feel a kind of retraction rather than expansion And this is actually the last edition of this was produced in September, so it's still coming out, but we don't necessarily know if it's being produced in Syria anymore. It could be produced in Istanbul or other places. One thing I want to do, though, is before I leave you, is to read two small parts from an essay that I commissioned for the original showing of this work by Mohammed Salami. He wrote a text called The Sacred Meme Magic, and he was trying to imagine who this graphic designer was and write a story in the first-person perspective. Around the time of the uprising, he was beginning to fall in love with the ordinary outer forms of communication. He was normcore before normcore was even coined, uninterested in the legacy of the 20th century avant-garde, which rewarded authenticity. His main objective at Dabiq magazine was to popularize the everyday look of corporate and government brochures by infusing it with the radical content of weaponized Islam. He enjoyed the matter-of-fact forms that framed pictures of explosions and beheadings. Amir designed the magazine while avoiding both kitsch-orientated sincerity and non-committal irony, which he saw as the tired and old strategies of global designers involved in the production of pop culture. And I think this is a really interesting way for Mohammed to see it, that he's really talking about somebody who sort of he's very kind of self-aware, but also is trying to kind of develop his own style. And then you kind of end up going into this incredibly kind of kitsch, kind of almost Dubai form of framing the war. So I want to finish there, but I really I look forward to seeing how this work develops over time, especially at the end of this kind of battle, and whether we think about this remain or this kind of artifact of a painting becoming potentially the last thing that's left as a remnant of this magazine. Because it's a PDF, it won't necessarily be something that will be available online on years to come. And we might at some point no longer have the magazine to look at. And these paintings, these kind of will become shadows and empty vessels of this moment of propaganda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Navine. We're welcoming up now our next guest, Maranke. Close, 8 out of 10, thank you. And Daniela from the Utrecht Data School. It's an interesting school because they are examining data, but they're doing it in a humanities context. So as researchers and lecturers, they have a unique perspective on the roles of particularly things like social networks, on how we build cultures around them. Join me in welcoming Maranke and Daniela.
All right. Thank you very much for having us. I think it's a very exciting panel to be presenting in. I also think that we can really tie some things together in our own presentation. As Tobias said, we're data scholars, so we'll be talking about data visualizations explicitly today. And we're going to be talking about how data visualizations really have this kind of soft power to them. So they really present things in a particular way, and in that regard, I think it also really ties in with the things that have been said before already, like questioning the things we're told and the design of data communication in a way, the magic that happens, please don't run, within data visualizations, how things are left out, and so forth. So yeah, we're really excited, and I think we should just get started, really. So data visualization, really, what are we talking about? So when you kind of wonder what it is you're talking about, you kind of just go to the dictionary, right? So we did that. So this is the Oxford English Dictionary, and it tells us, well, basically we're dealing with the representation of information. So far, so good. So what does that actually look like? Well, we have some visualizations for you, and some may be more straightforward than others. We're going to be discussing the one on the right here, so the hairball, basically. But there's also really a large body of scholarly literature about data visualization, and Basically, it really doesn't differ that much from the Oxford Dictionary, except now we're talking about data and data sets, so that makes sense, right? Data visualizations. But the bottommost quote, so data are mobilized graphically. I think that's really what we're getting at in this presentation. So it's not a neutral thing. Data are used in a particular fashion to communicate particular things. Let me just grab some water. And the way we want to talk about about data visualizations is looking at them as if they are interfaces. So like data visualizations, interfaces are things which are between us and another entity. So data visualizations lie between us as an audience, as a researcher, and the data, whereas interfaces are between us and a system, right? So that makes sense, I think. Both are also very much used for decision making, for making things sensible, for using particular instances. So an interface then, again, let's just do the thought exercise here. So an interface as means of or place of interaction between two systems, organizations, and so forth, makes sense. It's a way to connect, to make possible joint operation, to come into interaction with. So again, if we look at the academic definitions, this is a contact place. It's a meeting ground. And the one on the right here is, I think, very instructive, and we'll be talking about that explicitly as well. So the idea that interactive systems embody the possibility of direct manipulation. So of course, there are all kinds of interfaces. Of course, we have our GUIs, we have our Mac OS, we have our VGA cables, HDMI, and so forth. So there's all kinds of ways in which we can interact with things. So there's a lot of interfaces, really. So we'll be talking about data visualization as an interface. And I'll be handing the floor to my colleague Daniela, who will be telling you more about it.
Thank you, Maranke. Can you hear me? Yeah, that's good. So, in tackling the soft power of data visualizations and also summing up the definitions part, we have 2 points of departure we want to present to you. The first is the data visualization part. So, what we want to challenge is the static impression of finality that data visualizations present. And what we like to emphasize is that data visualizations are non-neutral presentations that we do interact with, also in making them. And the way we do that is take you with us on a thought experiment. So we like to think of data visualizations as interfaces, as an entry point to interact with data. And we will show you some examples in how we understand data visualizations as interfaces. The interesting thing here is also, like the starting point, we have to think of that interfaces somehow have that embody that idea of immediacy, like that idea of direct manipulations, but we rather like to think of them as programmed visions. And here I'm borrowing from a software study scholar, Wendy Chan. And programmed visions, that means that is somehow ideology reified in that process of making data visualizations, of interacting with the data we are researching. Also interacting with the data we are looking at when we look at as an audience at data visualizations. So we have 2 ways in which data visualizations can be thought of as an interface. The first is communicating data. So the way we see them, for example, in newspapers, there is a lot of data today, so we see more and more data visualizations in our newspapers, and also more complex visualizations, like the network visualization we showed you. The second one is more a way we as researchers interact with data, exploratory data analysis through data visualization. So let me give you first examples of visualizations as a way to connect with them as an audience. And we also use the word audience and thinking of film studies. Like, film is also not raw material, but more something that is edited and storified. So you make a lot of rhetorical choices in that process of visualizing data. That comes an interaction of algorithmic performativity and you as a human making choices using that software, for example. So here's an example of same data, different story. we found that this is a journalistic example. I'm also teaching journalistic students, so this is a really nice example to make them aware of how flipping around the visualization can really change the message visualization is communicating. And it is just flipped around, and the color scaling is changed in this visualization, and it tells someone a really different story. Like in the first one, the red is like really screaming to you, and the second one seems like a more neutral way of telling that actually it's getting better. Let me see. Then the second way of interfacing data. Now, as researchers, we sometimes think of ourselves as Neo in the Matrix, like interacting with this software, also trying to get to know like the ways in which those visualizations are programmed and what they do tell us about the data, the entities we are interacting with, and what they do tell us about the knowledge tools, like the software tools we are using, creating those forms of knowledge. And since we want to think about data visualization as interfaces, we also want to give you the experience of how it is to interact with this software. So we made a little movie of a software tool that we use a lot, sociological software tool for network visualization. And this tool is special because you get a lot of, it focuses on exploratory data analysis through visualization. So you get a lot of possibilities to interact with the data. And I will show you that. So this is basically the process we went through when we made that network visualizations we showed you. Basically, it was kind of the same actions we proceeded on the data. So you get an impression of that. The only difference is this is a way smaller data set. We are talking about around 70 nodes. And it is a data set of like a novel. You see novel characters and their connections with each other, and connections are co-appearances on a stage. So what you see is the Les Miserables network, which is kind of a basic exercise example in Gephi. So everybody who starts to work with the software is able to interact with that network. And what you see is like you can really like get into interaction with those nodes as well, and it will pull back because this algorithm centers nodes that have a lot of connections and also ties nodes together with a lot of connections. And there's a repulsion force, so kind of physical forces that are simulated, that a repulsion force between nodes that have no connection. So this is what we did to come to this visualization as well. It's way more complex. We are talking about 20,000 nodes in this network. What you see is actually the top of the Dutch Twitter sphere. In our research, we have a look at 2 weeks on Twitter in September 2016. And we are basically trying to study the communication infrastructure. So you see reply practices in this network of the most active account in those 2 weeks. All those accounts did at least sent at least 10 replies, or they received at least 10 replies in those 2 weeks. So it's really the top. And this is really an interesting case because it sort of exemplifies how interfacing with data through visualization can help you to get some entry points into the data, but it also emphasizes the problems you will experience. So on a meta level, it's really difficult because what you see is a static visualization. You experience this as a static visualization, and it kind of communicates finality to you. While we made a lot of choices during visualizing those data, and there are also some graphical issues in this software because it is under development, and it did not reach the point when they officially had a version 1.0 that they released, so it's still under construction. So we also experienced a lot of graphical issues, so we kind of stopped that algorithm at a certain point to have a view at the data. But what is kind of helpful in this process is that this kind of distant reading can be and should be accompanied by close reading. So we give you some examples of different media practices we experienced through interfacing with data through network visualization and Gephi. So we discovered that webcam accounts are kind of central in this network. And this is due to their specific way of communicating with all kinds of different people. They are kind of helping people through Twitter messages. So that means they are connected to a lot of other different people. But it's a kind of different media practice than this typical sphere of journalists and media and politicians media practices. So the way they are connected to each other is way different from the way these webcam accounts are connected to each other. There was another example of foresters, for example. Like, we discovered that they are pretty central as well, and dogs, like their dogs. So we really have dogs on Twitter. That is what we discovered as well. But it's also because one of them always said good morning to everyone. So just a random practice of wishing everybody good morning. But it somehow also messes up your data set in a way. And then you get to think of, okay, should we exclude those data? Or should we just like give rights to the data and we have all those practices in this image? And is there a way to make it more tangible for the audience as well? Like, could we think of more interactive ways of visualizing those networks? Like, also let you experience the process of all the historical choices you make during this visualization. So research communication, as we think, should be more interactive and more putting more this process of visualizing and discovering those media practice into the forefront. So I want to end up concluding that what we saw is the data visualization as interfaces hold rhetorical soft power. And they show us a particular perspective on data, but leave others out. And we are the ones who choose what is left out and what is in. So I have a concluding quote which somehow also summarizes what I said. And in this quote, you could just exchange the interfaces using data visualizations instead. Our data visualizations are stories we tell ourselves to ward off the senselessness that will continue to change the way we imagine information, and is doing so, they are bound to change us as well. And I think the senselessness here is kind of a central term that we should work on. We need ways to make those masses of data tangible and touchable and understandable. And tangible is not the same as understandable. So what we like to think about with you, because I think there are way more designers in this room and with way more design experience than we have. So our objective is to design visualization tools that help us to interface data, which put this process of rhetorical decision-making to the forefront. And this is what we like to add to the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Take it easy. I'm not going. Well, there he is. He's gone. Thank you very much, Maranke and Daniela. We've had some really interesting, sort of diverse breakdowns of this idea of what truth is through different kind of media, and I think already I'm seeing a continuum in the idea of analyzing visualization, whether it's visual language of graphic design or how we visualize data. Our next speaker is Dries Verhoeven, an artist from the world. We couldn't establish an actual place, so we just went with the world. And we're very pleased for Impakt is co-presenting with Spring and Autumn Festival, Phobiarama, which is in town, in a location that I can't pronounce. What was it?
Stad Schouwburg.
That's what I was going to say. And tickets are selling like hotcakes. He's going to talk all about the project and how it works, but essentially it's talking again about our media landscape and how it builds fear and enters in it into a sort of horrific dialogue, I suppose. So join me in welcoming Dries Verhoeven.
Thank you. I asked for only having 5 minutes because I don't want you to know too much on what I'm doing in the festival. But now I hear that I have a little bit more time, so let's see where this leads to. I put quite a wicked or a haunted machine, I must say, right in front of the Stad Schouwburg. I have to put it full screen. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, cool. So this wicked machine, I would call it Phobiarama, is presented right in front of the Stad Schouwburg since last Thursday it was, till next Sunday. A black tent that shows itself as a fairground attraction, as a representation of the culture of fear, the theater of fear, as it now and then pops up in our media landscape. The other panelists have been talking a lot on strategies, right? In data that tries to reach us. In the creation of this work, I was thinking a lot on us, on how we receive. What does it mean to be confronted with the messages from Islamic State? What it means to be confronted with the messages from Geert Wilders, Hillary Clinton, anyone who would like to influence us. So I was basically thinking a lot on our fear receptors. All of us have these fear receptors on the left side and the right side of our brain. They're very small. They're like these small nodules that are almond-shaped. They're called the amygdalae, a little bit like sunflower seeds. Without these seeds, we wouldn't shiver. We need them to be in fear. And I was wondering, what does it mean for these nodules to be confronted with this and with this? We know the difference, but what happens in our brain might maybe give the same experience. What does it mean that the danger is happening in our surroundings, that the moment that we shiver, it is because we see something happening right in front of our face, or when we see it happening in our the devices that we have in our hands? Of course, we need those fear receptors. In the old days, when we were confronted with a predator that was hiding behind a tree, it was very helpful that we had these, because at the spot we could decide if we would flee or fight, right? Nowadays, predators are not hiding anymore behind trees, very rarely, but they are framed as such in the media for political reasons. And once more, the question, are we able to distinguish from what is real and what is unreal, from what is a strategy and from what happens randomly? The danger nowadays comes from terrorist organizations, but it's not real danger, it's expected danger, it's the plausibility of danger, it's assumed danger that is coming from terrorist organizations that want us to be in fear, and it comes also from the ones who warn us for these terrorist organizations, and it comes also from the ones who warn us for the ones who warn us. You could ask yourself the question, do they maybe help each other? Do they maybe need each other to tell their story? The way IS is framed by, for example, the right-wing politicians, as Geert Wilders, might be reappropriated by the terrorists themselves. Maybe all of them are helped by the fact that they are framed as monsters. That brings us to a society where, on the one hand, we are more safe than ever before. The chance for you to die an unnatural death is smaller than ever before. On the other hand, you were mentioning panic attacks. We live in a time where more people are diagnosed with anxiety disorders than ever before. What does that mean? Is it maybe possible that our fear receptors are not able to distinguish? That's a notion that I wanted to address by making Phobiarama, which is, on the one hand, a fairground ride, a horror house. On the other hand, you could say you move around in your bumper cart in a room that is overly secured, that is maybe a representation of the vigilant society in which we're living, where everybody's keeping an eye on each other to be alert. In 45 minutes, you're seated in this bumper cart and you're making a ride through our media landscape. And the big question is, how do you respond? How do your fear receptors, your amygdala, respond when this media landscape is, during these 45 minutes, getting more and more hysterical, getting more and more bewitched? I cannot tell you how we do that. That's why I wanted to keep this talk short, because it wouldn't help the test that your fear receptors are confronted with once they enter the door of Phobiarama. See it as a laboratory where you are the guinea pigs. You go inside and you experience till what extent your common sense is helping you and when your deeper instincts and your gut feelings are taking over. It's officially sold out, but there might be still tickets. We heard also that, or every day, there are people that don't show up because of the rain or because they don't feel like it. Maybe they are afraid of panic attacks. So if you really want to see it, please show up. It's 7 times a day, from 3 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, every hour, right in front of the Stad Schouwburg. And if you're really in need for a ticket, come to me and maybe I can help you out. Thanks for that.
Do you want to take a seat? Can I invite George, Navine, Maranke, and Daniela back up to the stage for a little funky Q&A? Let's do this. Going to move on in. Well, we're in the drawing room. You know, it's quite glamorous. Warren and Dan last night had this kind of quite abstract office lobby set up. This is a bit more between two ferns, exactly so. So thank you all for your presentations. It was amazing to see such a variety of ways of practicing and thinking, whether it's through sociology and science, or through art and painting, or through trying to create lived experiences for people. As I said earlier, I think this theme of visualizing and trying to get to truth by somehow aestheticizing it and making it is prevalent through all the things that we've seen. Do you think that's possible, or is that just an ongoing project in some way? Maybe we'll just go round. Did you guys get the question? I'm amplified, so I don't know why not.
Because we were getting water. We were watering.
I was saying that a lot of these projects are the projects you're doing, but also the projects you're analyzing, are in some way visualizations of meaning that hope to get to a truth by doing that visualization, right? Is that possible, or is that just an ongoing, endless project? A bit like Navine mentioned transformation, right? And alchemy is this practice of transformation with the aim of getting closer to God, but never quite achieving it. Do you think you'll ever make the most truthful visualization? Yeah.
No, and I don't hope so. Like I think it's an ongoing process. And what I like about visualizing data, for example, is that you always oscillating between those states of trying to find the truth and knowing that there is not really something like truth, because you have different perspectives, and perspectives change when you change, for example, the tools you use. So, no, I hope that it's an ongoing process and also a reflective one. Yes, that would be my answer.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more. We're also writing a paper on this, so yeah, I think this is really something that you have to be very honest about as a scholar. It's the tools which you use to visualize something, for instance, really frames that object in a particular way. For instance, the way we use Gephi, especially with the colors, it really opens up this whole nasty box of the idea of filter bubbles, which is not really something that we really experience when we look qualitatively at the data, but it's something that is suggested, for instance, by the visualization, and it's something you continuously have to reflect on. Yeah.
Sure. I think it's not only the technology, it's more like also as a human you have a perspective. So there's this nice notion of the God trick by Donna Haraway, also science technology scholar, and I think that is also, you should make, this is also something we want to think about in making this process visible, that there is always a position from which you visualize data, and always your perspective that kind of frames the way we see the data. So, and that should be explicit in a way.
I think, yeah, and jumping on from that, Yeah, I'm glad that Haraway came up, because I think in this it's not necessarily about there being a truth or one truth, but more finding that situated knowledge and trying to bring that out and transform that in some capacity. So one of the things I found when I was kind of a decade ago more in anthropology, there's the kind of the tension in finding that work with the writing of how you present the situatedness through text, and having made the jump now more into different forms of material production, thinking more how to kind of bring out the situated with the experiential aspects of these systems, whether it's through affect in whatever that looks like, forms of materiality, forms of haptic, like touching all the things, but a way to kind of step back from it, there being any inherent objective God's eye truth, and think more that how do you bring and layer those parts of the system together in a way that also very deliberately, very intentionally tries to draw attention to the parts which are being held up as being somehow objective in some way. I think, yeah, I think I said, for me, a lot of the work recently with Delta Entertainment has been trying to present that work on fairly complex digital technological systems about sexually explicit material in as low-tech a way as possible without it being sexually explicit, to kind of just flatten that stuff down and then try and see what's left at the other side of it.
Do you just quickly, while we've got you, do you see similarities between the way that you and Navine are thinking about the content of the things that you're looking at? You know, because Navine, you were very clear about not wanting to replicate the content. You know, that's not your role as an artist. That's not what you're trying to do. You're not trying to talk about the horror in its material form. And you're also trying to remove the content of the sexual entertainment industry from your analysis of their use of technology.
I think there's a number of levels in there. One of the things I've been quite mindful about all the way through, and I think we're coming from maybe different parts of the power spectrum here, is a lot of the work that I did was with, again, highly stigmatized spaces, people who very deliberately did not put their name, couldn't put their names onto LinkedIn, even talking about the companies they worked for. And I've still, that's still at least the current work in progress, thinking about what it means to be able to discuss this stuff without wanting to pull back and reveal and identify too much. So it's still, for me, that part of it is more about care and privacy of participants as much as anything else. It's not my role. It shouldn't be my role, and it feels like potentially quite a dick move to try and bring that in some capacity. The other part of trying to avoid the sexually explicit part is, I'm not going to remember who did it. I think it's Gail Rubin, talks about one of the reasons why it's really difficult to do any kind of work around sexuality, particularly sexuality in commerce, is you get this very heightened response to it. The minute it comes out on the table, everyone's like, "Hey, you're talking about that and in pot plants, are you?" You're like, "Yes, but actually, can we, So you have to take into account that this thing, by dint of being sex and sexuality, is going to draw a much larger audience and a very specific type of reactions that it would do if you were talking about the furniture industry. So you kind of, again, simultaneously have to take that into consideration, for me at least, but also be very aware of what it means to present that to an audience in whatever form that looks like.
Mm-hmm. What question am I going to answer?
Oh, I don't know, just pick from the bunch.
No, I think as long as we're not conscious of what's influencing us from outside of us, we should continue making what we're making. And I don't know, when we've been talking on this topic, and also when I was making my piece, I realized that, of course, when you're talking about fear rhetoric and politics of fear, we discuss many times the people that come from the right side of the political spectrum. But when you start to realize that actually, since they are doing that, or since fear has become such an important thing to influence us, that also on the left side of the political spectrum, actually exactly the same is happening. And I think it's important always to think of the audience that is seeing your work, and not to opening up only the messages from the Donald Trumps around us, but also from the ones who are fighting the Donald Trumps around us, who are using the same mechanisms, who are using maybe comparable rhetoric to fight what they want to fight. And then the question is, can they still be nuanced when the media apparatus is so much influenced by the tools that are set up by these extreme people?
It's your turn.
My turn, okay. I think the thing about Well, I mean, I basically said that I don't produce truth, so I'm not really interested in truth. But what I am interested in is what it is to create a space, a visual space, where you can have a relationship with the viewer, where you're actually presenting them a surface upon which they can project that which they already know. And that's why I don't show pictures of execution videos, but often I will have the name of what it is or other things, because I don't personally think that we need to see that again, but I think that most of us would know what that thing was. And the truth of the matter is that we already contain those images, and there's no need to represent them. And I think that's the truth that I'm trying to find, that I'm trying to expose, is how much of this is already within us. And not to push more in, but to pull something out. And that's the engagement with the work that I'm looking for.
I think just before we go to the audience, I have one last thing I really want to ask. There's quite a few things. I've made quite a lot of notes that are now illegible. First of all, Roboto is the world's greatest typeface. It's just true.
The other one they use is Oswald.
Really?
Yeah. Oswald and Garamond.
Well, Garamond is a bit of a classic. I can see that.
Classic.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about this. The thing I was hinting at, I guess, in my introduction to this panel is this: that post-truth, more than just questioning our contemporary landscape, as an idea, seems to be questioning the very industrial, mechanized notion that there is even such a thing as objective truth in the first place. The idea that the camera can take the perfect photo and so on and so forth, and the mechanization of the universe that led us to this scientific rationality. Is there a way that we can be decent and human and empathic and emancipated while letting go of this notion that there is some perfect objective truth, and perhaps just accept the plurality of subjective life? It's not a complicated question. I made it sound very complicated, I think. you can just say I don't know.
Do we start?
Yes, please.
I think it's just down to education and mindfulness. So I think the most important thing is to be aware of how the images that you're, or the images or the content that you're being exposed to is constructed, understanding the layers of how it reaches you, and then being mindful of that. And that doesn't mean that by understanding the process it's less or more truthful to you, but having a notion about the technologies that create this are at the basis of understanding. And I think that's the problem we face, is that we're getting a greater distance, people have a greater and greater distance between how the thing is produced and their interaction with it.
I think that's at the root of a lot of the thinking behind the curation of this festival as well. Does anyone else have anything to say, or should we open up some... Daniela, you look like you've got something to say.
I'm not an interface designer, but I also realized that it's somehow inbuilt in our interfaces, that idea of immediacy. And I somehow, maybe that's like a plan I will never reach, but I somehow would love to think about different kind of interfaces. And maybe that's also because we brought up that idea of data visualization as interfaces, because it kind of makes you aware of all those processes that went into the design and the choices that I made.
And all the kind of inherent biases.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's open it up a bit. Let's have some audience questions. I see a hand in the middle from a French woman. How do I know she's French? They're all wondering.
Yes. Hi. Got a question for George and Navine. So both of you. So George, you have a project about porn that doesn't really feature porn, but the relationship to technology, and you have a project about your paintings that about the layout and not the content. So I was wondering, what is the importance of the choice of your medium? So you had text shown, and you have the layout. So what is the importance of that choice of medium? And if you could maybe talk about the process that led you to choose that way of representing your work and what it's about.
I think at least for that piece, there was a kind of an immediacy to it. There was a quite tight production time framework, and I had this body of work which I knew very, very intimately. And the thing that I think particularly for that piece that I really liked is the language of those magazines is really funny. It's, you know, it's something that, you know, I could abstract from and had like kind of tangled myself up actually quite a lot, which about thinking, does it have to be text-based? You know, surely at this stage, you know, is text the best way of doing it? And I think for that particular piece, to draw out the different bits of language and to juxtapose them against each other, against, you know, maybe a 3-year period of this panic about different payment systems or the idea of where the futures come from, or bringing out the in-jokes, for that part of it, it felt like to bring out the linguistical choices that were being made there, and the humour as well, and the context of the humour, whether intentionally or otherwise, was what I wanted to do. And also as a way to try and collapse down or get to a kind of a different level of looking at 30 years, 3 decades worth of material. For future stuff, I've been thinking a lot about the swag that I've got and what to do with that, and that's not textual, but the magazines are textual. It's, again, it was the language element of it that for me felt really important, at least for that piece.
So the medium is not layout, it's paint, but I'm sure that's what you meant. Yeah, so a couple of things about, I mean, I'm a painter as well, so like everything I do is painting. But I'm very interested in paint and in colour and like the act of painting. And for me, art is a transformative process. So it's about ISIS, but really it's about what happens when I engage with that input, and then it goes through me and then comes out as something else. The artwork is like a different object. But the colour palette is also something I didn't talk about. Like over the years, I've reduced my colour palette to only using RGB and CMYK. So, you know, this is very much the issue around this object, is that we're talking about a magazine, which is not a physical object, but a digital object. And the colours are trying to actually have a symbolic value, you know, by representing both print colour and digital colour at the same time. And also the paint is, it's gouache, which is essentially pigment with the smallest amount of binder, we call it, that's interacting with that. So it's really about pure colour. And it's also made with painting methods and structures that have a very, very long history, like hundreds of years of history. So we know that going into the future, those panels are going to exist. This is what I was trying to say at the end, much longer than the PDF itself will exist. So the paint is really about the kind of abstract issues for me, which are at the key of what interests me about this magazine, and not really about ISIS, but about the phenomena of this magazine itself.
We've probably got time for another question. I don't mind whoever gets it first. There you go.
Hello. I try to explain as clearly as possible. So I'm thinking just this kind of rhetoric language makes me think of astrology. So sometimes astrology, they have different interpretation of those, even in modern times and also in ancient times. So when, in a rhetoric language, for example, Navine, when you were doing the extract, the layout or the color palette from the magazine, but you have your own subjective experience and interpretation in it. And you don't exist in vacuum, so you exist in this century. You get affected by the aesthetics around you. And modern aesthetics will be different from the previous, or maybe 100 years ago. So I just wonder, are you interested in how do you measure this kind of effects in it? And are you curious about the feedbacks from the people who are from the same times with you? And also maybe like, I don't know, do you want to create something which might be timeless or more, yeah.
Yeah, I think, the key of this thing is about trying to understand something that you don't understand. Like, I think astrology kind of was a way, it was a form of science, but it was also a way of like determining, like it was, a form of augury. It was telling a future. You were trying to determine something that hadn't happened yet and create like, it's kind of dealing with fear in a way. And in the same way that I'm never going to know what it was like to be that graphic designer, I'm never going to meet him. Like, I'm trying to like determine and come to terms with a space that's very distant from me, but somehow has a place in me and my experience of the world. And I'm trying to touch something. And for me, that's through the act of labour and through the act of trying to really understand this person's process. I'm going to assume it's a man. I know it's actually a man. In order to understand something and be less fearful of it, in a way. And yeah, I'm always interested what people think of the work, always. And actually most of my work is mural painting, and I do huge works in museums where it's a performance. So actually I always want the viewers to come and talk to me, and that often changes the work, it's a very interactive thing. But I think what I said before is really important. I want to pull something out of people rather than push it in. And that's where, and if they can then bring that to me, then I think that's where the real interaction is.
Excellent, thank you. We have to end there, unfortunately, because it's 3 o'clock and we have to swap over the hall for the fantastic Kishi the Vampire, which will be in here at 5:30. I've told a lot of people that it's my personal highlight of the program, actually, so I really encourage you to come and see it. We also have a screening starting at 3:30 in Studio 3 up there, and that's Eric Bunger's